Thank you so very much. It's a pleasure, it's an honor to be here to talk to everyone. What you just saw was a 15-minute film drawn from material that we shot in order to make a full-length film called Hell on Earth. This specifically was to address the issue of refugees and immigrants in Europe and to this country. We made it last January and February, not by coincidence on those dates. We felt we wanted to address and hopefully be helpful in the national conversation that seemed to be sort of roiling the waters in this country about what to do in a country filled with immigrants, what to do about immigration. And we thought we could add one piece of the puzzle by making this short film. So that's what you've seen. I made this film and the full-length Hell on Earth with my dear friend and colleague, Nick Quested, who's sitting right down there. And he was the producer on Restrepo, my first film, and on forwards and until this. And he did, I made this film. I'm going to, in a moment, talk about why I got into filmmaking and why we came to this topic. But I'm the first time in my life I did not shoot footage for a documentary that I made. I made this film. I never left the United States when I made this film. I was really in the role of director, co-director, once we got all the material together. Nick was absolutely brilliant and intrepid in going, of course we couldn't go into Syria. I mean, we could have, but we would have been killed. Probably kidnapped and killed, as so many other journalists have been. So we had to make this film sort of remotely in some ways. And so Nick just did an incredible job along the Turkish-Syrian border and in northern Iraq, finding people through fixers and relatives and friends and anyone he could get his hands on, finding people who were in Syria, who maybe we could get a camera to, maybe we could help guide them to shoot for us because they were living there, they could do it safely, we couldn't. So at any rate, I wanted to acknowledge Nick and some of these issues that may come up in the Q&A later. He's much, sort of more knowledgeable about than I am. So I might even bounce a question or two to him if I have to. So my father is a war refugee twice over. My father grew up in Spain. His father was a journalist, he was European. He grew up in Spain. He and his family fled Madrid when he was a young boy before the Franco's fascist forces took Madrid during the Civil War. They fled to Paris. He went to high school in Paris and was pushed out when the Nazis rolled in. His father was Jewish, so they were pushed out when the Nazis rolled in, and he wound up in this country. He was a physicist. He went to MIT and Harvard. He worked on a lot of actually very important programs in this country, military programs. He was always enormously grateful that he was able to come to this country and become a citizen. He married an American woman, my mother. This country gave him a home, gave him an education, a profession. He was very, very grateful, and he was lucky to have us, and we were equally lucky to have him. So his Europeanness really, his sheer sort of foreignness, really shaped how I saw the world. I realized being American was one way of being a human being, but not necessarily the normal way. There is no normal way to be a human being. I understood because of my father that the world is composed of a multitude of countries and cultures and races, and we just happened to be one of them. That was an extremely important lesson for me when I was young. Because of his experience in war, because war had affected our family so deeply, I was very curious about it. I grew up during Vietnam. I was a little kid, I grew up in a very quiet suburb. Surely war would never touch directly Belmont, Massachusetts. And I was very curious about war. Like, why does it happen so much? What's it like? How would I act in a war? Would I be a good soldier or a bad soldier? And I found a war for myself. There was a civil war in Bosnia. Sarajevo was besieged by a modern army. They were using the civilians basically for target practice for 3 years. They killed and wounded around 1/5 of the population of that city, men, women, children, old people, everybody. I went there. That was my first experience with war, with trauma, and with the incredible sense of meaning that comes from being in a war zone and having a role in it. My role is as a journalist, but it was absolutely intoxicating, that sense of meaning and urgency. And I realized that whenever I wasn't in Sarajevo, I would get depressed. That was where I wanted to be, and I kept covering wars. I was in Africa. I started going to Afghanistan in the mid-90s, 1996. I had a very rough experience in Afghanistan in the north in 2000 with the Northern Alliance, Massoud's forces, as they were fighting the Taliban. It was a year before 9/11. Back then the Taliban had an air force, they had MiGs, they had tanks, they had artillery, they had everything. They had Pakistan, I mean, they had everything. And that was my first really profound experience with trauma and horror. And it affected me for a very long time. I've always been an author. I love working with words. I feel like if you can use words, these scratches on a page, to create a visual image, to create a story, to create something that people are compelled by, that you've wrought a kind of magic. I love that process. But at some point, I realized that, and I've written about a lot of things other than war, of course. But at some point, I realized that in war, in combat, the sort of crux of the matter, which is when there is ongoing combat, that's exactly the moment where you can't take notes very effectively. I've tried to take notes during a firefight. And there's two problems with it. One is you cannot read them afterwards, right? And the other is you just look so damn stupid doing it, right? So I realized, and also I realized later, I wrote a book about the legal system at one point, and I researched eyewitness testimony and how flawed it is, and I realized, oh, that's me in combat. That's anyone in combat. I mean, your memory of events, in fact, your perception of events in a crisis like that, in a car accident, in a house fire, in combat, whatever, that awful shooting in Vegas a couple of days ago, your perception of events in your memory is unbelievably distorted from reality. So I thought, oh, I'll just start shooting video. And that would be how I take notes when things are moving too fast and are too scary to write down. And so I started shooting video, and I realized I really liked it. I didn't think I was particularly good at it, but I was good enough to record what was going on around me. And I found something amazing when I would go back and watch the video. The difference between my memory and what I was actually looking at was, I mean, as a journalist, it was sort of appalling. I mean, I try very, very hard to document reality. And particularly in those kinds of circumstances, you really can't. So the video camera became a very important tool. I remember once at Restrepo, an outpost where I was with American soldiers about 10 years ago, the outpost was half built, and we got hit very hard from multiple sides. And I was behind a HESCO, and there was a guy shooting a .240, like right over there, like 10 feet from me. And I wanted to get up sort of next to him. I was shooting video. And there was so much gunfire coming in, I just didn't quite dare leave cover. And I felt bad about that. And as a result, I got a terrible shot of him from the back, like 10 feet away. And then I later watched the video, and between me and him, the sand was moving. I mean, so many rounds were coming in, I didn't even see it. I mean, I would have been shot. So, at any rate, I was sold on the idea of shooting video, and when I was out at Restrepo, my colleague and I, Tim Hetherington, I started this project. I thought maybe I can write a book about a platoon in combat and make a documentary. I'll be shooting all that video anyway. And I was lucky enough to meet Tim Hetherington, and he started working with me. Tim was an amazing photographer. He was British, became a dear friend and brother, colleague. He lost his life in Libya in 2011. But Restrepo is our film. And what we wanted to do was, I mean, for me, I'm a journalist. When I write books, when I write articles, when I speak, or when I make a film, the only thing I'm doing is trying to give an accurate and neutral portrayal of the truth. I have opinions, I have political opinions, I have all kinds of opinions. I'm happy to, outside of when I don't have a journalist hat on, I'm happy to tell you what I think about anything. But as a journalist, the last thing I want to do is try to lead you in some kind of unfair, manipulative way to my truth, to my opinion. The reason I don't want to do that is because that's actually not journalism. Journalism is to professionally not have an opinion that you're trying to convince other people of. And everything else is editorial, which is great. Editorial is great, but just don't call it journalism. And so for me, when Tim and I made Restrepo, we had opinions about the war and what the mistake, the things that were working, the things that weren't working, whether we should be there or not there. I mean, we had all kinds of opinions. But what we wanted to do with Restrepo is make a film about what it feels like to be a soldier. Make a film about what it felt like to be a soldier at a tiny little outpost on a ridge that was getting shot at almost every day and had absolutely no contact with the outside world other than the company headquarters. And so we were not trying to make some kind of statement about the war. We were trying to portray what it was like to be young. It was all men out there, young men in combat. And that we felt was a truth that has endured for hundreds, thousands of years. It happened to be Restrepo in 2007, but it could have been any war, any group of young men in any war, virtually. Their emotional reality, I think, is eternal. And so we made Restrepo, and our idea was there will be nothing in the film that wasn't in the valley, the Korangal Valley. If the ambassador wasn't out there, he's not in the film. If the general wasn't out there, he's not in the film. The only things you see in that film are people who were in the valley fighting. There's no musical score because life doesn't have a musical score. We wanted to feel like a 90-minute deployment. And as a result, interestingly, I happen to be a Democrat. I know a lot of Democrats, I know a lot of liberals, I know a lot of people who are anti-war. Anti-war is actually not, I'm anti-human suffering. I wouldn't say, I think anti-war is too clumsy a phrase. The world is too complicated to be completely against something that's that big. But I'm definitely against human suffering. But I know a lot of people who are anti-war who were really mad at me for not having Restrepo be an anti-war film. And I'm like, but I'm a journalist. Like, it's not supposed to be journalism isn't supposed to be pro or anti anything. And I would point out to these people, this is exactly, you guys had the exact same problem with Fox News having an opinion about something, and now you want me to have an opinion. Like, you can't have it both ways. Journalism does not have an opinion. But it does have an emotional content. It can have emotional content, and that's what we were going for with Restrepo. So I continued making films. I made 3 more films. One, sadly, was about Tim. We were supposed to be on assignment in Libya, right after we were at the Oscars for Restrepo. A few weeks later, we were going to cover the Libyan civil war. The last moment, practically, I couldn't go for personal reasons. Tim went on his own, and he was hit by fragments from a mortar round fired by Gaddafi's forces in the city of Misrata. He was hit in the leg. It was not necessarily a mortal wound. He bled out in the back of a pickup truck, rebel pickup truck, racing for the Misrata Hospital. He missed it by a few minutes. He missed having another 40 years of life by a few minutes. And I went through all of the absolutely horrible reactions that I saw in soldiers. Guilt should have been me. I should have been there to protect him. I could have helped him. Like all this stuff. I mean, all of a sudden I understood these soldiers who were trying to convince me that the death of one of their buddies over there was their fault, their personal fault. I'm like, what are you talking about? You were 300 meters away. How is it your fault? I never got it until Tim was killed. And I watched myself do the same thing, and I really sank into quite a black pit. I mean, I was really depressed. I'm not a shrink, I'm not a doctor, I'm just guessing here, but I think a certain component of PTSD for soldiers that were in combat, actually in combat, a certain component of PTSD, a certain part of it is simply guilt that you survived and someone you loved didn't. The people in Vegas are going to have the same problem. Any situation like that creates an enormous amount of guilt, and it will kill you. I mean, if you let it, it will kill you, either literally or figuratively. And I sank down into that hole. It took me a long time to get out of it. And it was part of the loss of my first marriage, was the state of mind that I sank into. I decided not to cover combat anymore. It wasn't so much that I was scared of getting killed. I'd made some accommodation in my mind for that happening. But after Tim died, I realized what me getting killed would do to everyone I loved, because I watched it happen to everyone that Tim loved. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to be that person. I didn't want to do that to people who were not getting a vote in this of whether I went overseas or not. So I stopped going overseas. I stopped covering combat. The Arab Spring turned into, some of the Libya is still unresolved. It's a lot worse than Tunisia, that had a revolution that ended quite well with a fairly democratic government. Nothing was as bad as Syria. And Nick and I decided a couple of years ago now, I guess, to try to make a film about Syria, to explain the Syrian civil war, again, in neutral terms. How do civil wars start? Why does this happen? Why did ISIS start? I mean, you can say, oh, ISIS is evil all day long. That doesn't explain why they happened, why it happened. And in the film, I won't get into it now, maybe later in the Q&A, but there are very, very specific reasons you can point to for why something like ISIS would start. And so the result was a 90-minute film. It challenges some cherished beliefs of some people about our role in Iraq, about the nature of violence in every society, including our own. ISIS, the horrible things ISIS has done in public squares, executing people, every single European society, and to include America, has done the same thing, to make a point. About authority and control and law and order. The lynchings in the South were no different from ISIS killing people. Same thing. So the film is about Syria, but it really is about a broader conversation about violence, and ultimately, just to bring it back to refugees and immigration, when do you intervene? When is it more cruel to stand by and watch another country sink into civil war than it is to wage war and step in? I was in Bosnia. The Bosnian Civil War was stopped by a 10-day NATO bombardment. That's the short version of why I can't say I'm against war, because it took war to stop that horror show. But for me, it's an enduring moral question. When do you intervene? Are you causing more harm than good? Ultimately, are you saving lives and preventing human suffering or not? And that to me is the ultimate question. I'm sure I've run out the clock on my talk here, so maybe we can get to the Q&A part if you guys are ready. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So welcome to World Affairs. This is the weekly broadcast of the World Affairs Council. I'm Jane Wales, CEO. We're in San Francisco. We're at Marines Memorial Association having a conversation with Sebastian Junger. He is the author of The Perfect Storm, of a book called Tribe, in which he focuses in part on the experience of veterans when they return home, in part for that. And of course, and a book entitled War. He has produced at least 2 documentary films, one of them Restrepo, and the other one, which we'll talk a lot about today, is Hell on Earth, The Fall of Syria and the Rise of ISIS. I wanted to start, Sebastian, though, with your own motivations, because you have reported from Bosnia, you've gone into Afghanistan for a period of time. This most recent documentary is on Syria. You've referred to war and crisis as a source of meaning. Say something about what does that mean for you?
I think humans feel that there's great meaning afoot when the consequences of something are large. That gives us a sense of meaning. When you can make choices that have no consequence in your life or in other people's lives, it doesn't feel as meaningful. So a game of golf might be enormously pleasurable, but I would argue it's not meaningful in that way. And so what happens in war is that everything becomes meaningful because everything potentially has consequences. I know for a fact that on a certain day 10 years ago, almost exactly 10 years ago, I was leaning against a HESCO, leaning against some sandbags at OP Restrepo on a quiet hot September day. And had I been leaning 2 or 3 inches more to the left, I'd be dead. And a bullet hit the sandbag. The first round of the first burst of an hour-long firefight hit the sandbag right next to my head, close enough to kick dirt into my face, sand into my face. So even where you stand, where you lean, can be a matter of life and death, and that gives life a kind of unearthly glow. And once you experience that, it's quite hard to give it up.
You've written about the experience of a warrior, the experience of a soldier, a Marine, an airman, a sailor, coming home from war and feeling a sense of loss. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, first of all, you're giving up this sort of anguishing sense of meaning, an intoxicating sense of meaning, when you leave a war zone and come home. But more importantly, at least for the American soldiers that I was with in Afghanistan, combat is conducted with platoons of soldiers, 30, 40, 50 people. Anthropologists will tell you that's roughly the size of the living group, the typical living group for our human ancestors for the last hundreds of thousands of years. We are wired to function and to care deeply about groups of 30, 40, 50 people, to sleep shoulder to shoulder with them, hunt, defend ourselves with them, go through hardships together, dangers together, joys together. That's what we're wired for. And so when you have soldiers who experience that in combat, or even in a rear base, in a support unit, even that, it will even happen with that. When they experience the intense communalism of a life in a platoon, when you take them out of that evolutionary true spot, and you pick them up and you drop them back down in modern society, all of a sudden they're an individual. They're not surrounded by a group 24/7. Soldiers get their sense of safety, physical safety, and by extension, emotional safety from the proximity of others. If you're alone on the battlefield, you are in a lot of trouble. For that matter, if you're alone in the wilderness, you're in a lot of trouble. Humans don't do well by themselves. They do very well in groups. So you're taking soldiers from that communal environment to a very isolating modern environment, and they miss it. They miss the war because they miss being in that kind of primordial human group. You don't have to even be traumatized. Volunteers for the Peace Corps, when they come home, around a quarter of them sink into a significant depression when they come back, because they are no longer in the communal setting of a small village in a developing country. It's part of our human heritage. We're a social species. We're wired to live that way. And that makes coming home to an affluent, wealthy, modern society psychologically very, very difficult.
And that would be particularly the case in an instance when the war itself is unpopular. And so you don't come back to that, to the hero's welcome you may deserve.
I think that is a sort of layer that just adds a little bit of extra sort of bit of anguish, but I think you can come back from wars that had enormous support by the population and still feel like, my God, I don't belong in this society. Yeah. I belong with my guys. What am I doing? I'm not safe. I'm in a bed. My family and I are in a house by ourselves. We're not safe, you know. And the sort of single family unit, the person alone in their apartment, like we did not evolve to live that way. We don't feel safe that way. And when soldiers experience group living and come back to that, it's very, very difficult. And we know, psychologists will tell you, as affluence rises in society, the suicide rate goes up. The depression rate goes up. The PTSD rate goes up. There was an amazing study comparing Nigeria to North America. They studied women in urban and rural environments in both countries. And women in urban North America, the wealthiest group of the study, had the highest rates of depression. The people with the lowest rates of depression were in rural Nigeria, who were the poorest people. So poverty, along with enormous stresses, does enforce a collaborative existence that psychologically is very, very buffering. Very, very buffering for mental health problems.
So we started by talking about the experience of the combatant. Let's talk about the non-combatant, as you do in this film, where you focus on the refugees, in particular from Syria. Just give us a sense of the scope of the problem. We've got like 65 million people displaced, driven from their homes around the world. To what extent is this a sort of a combination of Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan? What about Africa? Where are we seeing these refugee flows?
Right. I mean, where do you draw the line? If it's just war refugees, I mean, the number changes every month, every week, so I don't even know what the current tally is. It's millions and millions of people have been displaced just from Syria. And there's wars all over the Middle East, all over the world. It's the sort of displaced war refugee story is is a journalistic standard. I mean, it just comes up every few months, every year. There's some Burma right now. I mean, there's always a new crisis where some group of unfortunates is being pushed out or are fleeing. So what does this do? Most immediately, it destabilizes the surrounding countries that these people spill into. And let me just say again, we should not blame them for fleeing, right? This is not some moral failure on their part. They're doing exactly what any of us would do in that circumstance. They are fleeing to protect their families, to preserve their futures, something any of us would do in those circumstances. So they're spilling into neighboring countries, destabilizing them. In addition, people who languish in refugee camps long enough, they don't get an education.
Right.
You know, they are vulnerable to poor thinking. They're vulnerable specifically, in this case, to a sort of jihadist inculcation. You really don't want young people languishing in refugee camps without an education for too many years, because you're creating a whole other crop of completely disenfranchised people who think the world has abandoned them, and it has. And along comes someone who says, you know what? You can right this wrong. You just need a little courage in your heart. You need to believe in your religion, and we can make this right. You don't want to create people like that. So I do understand the kind of hard-nosed, look, it's their problem, not our problem. Why does America have to keep paying for everything? I mean, I totally get it. I think you can make a moral argument for wealthy countries, including ours, to take care of the suffering in the world. I mean, I think you can make just a moral argument. But let's not even do that. Let's just make a practical argument. We want to do everything we can to make sure that that kind of extremist thought is minimized, does not have a chance to take root. My experiences in Afghanistan started in '96. I remember being told when I was there, and just right when the Taliban were taking over Kabul. I got shot at by the Taliban on the outskirts of Kabul in the summer of '96. I was told, listen, we don't like these people. I was told by a Pashtun in Kabul, we don't like these people. They're too extreme, they're horrible, but we're going to let them take over Afghanistan because we need the civil war has got to stop. The corruption's just has overrun our government. Like we need help. And the Taliban, as awful as they are, they will straighten this country out. The reason that was happening is because the United States, to fight a proxy war with the Soviets, filled Afghanistan up with arms for a whole decade, right? It worked, right? The Soviets got really beat up in Afghanistan. It was part of what led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. We won that round, right? They pulled out, the Soviets pulled out in '89, and what did we do? We pulled out. We didn't continue a level of assistance, the same level of assistance that we did with weapons, with school books for children, rebuilding schools, rebuilding bridges, bringing in some help with forming a new government. We didn't do any of that. We just left. And as a result, we got a failed state for 10 years that eventually produced 9/11, and we don't want another 9/11. So the self-protective, the self-interested argument for involvement in these crisis spots in the world is that when you leave them to languish, the Somalias of the world, the Afghanistans of the world, the Syrias of the world, they produce a huge amount of human suffering and a really virulent strain of extremism that may reach us, and it did on 9/11.
Let me take you to the particulars of Syria. These refugees, and 4 million at first, I think it's closer to 5 million now, have spilled over into the frontline states, into Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. What is their experience there? Some of them are living within communities, and some are in camps. Talk about the experience they have there, and why do they then, some portion of them, choose to move on, take a very treacherous journey to Europe?
I mean, it's hard to generalize. There's the entire spectrum of experiences for these people. The Marwan and Radwan, the two gentlemen that you saw in this film, and their families, I found them extraordinarily articulate and ethical, like really beautiful families. I mean, really, like, these are beautiful people. One of them was a garage mechanic. I mean, they seem very educated. They're really not. They're just ordinary people. But clearly very smart and pretty switched on and resourceful. And so they made it to Turkey. They tried to get to Greece. I mean, the dream for everybody is to get to the West, right? We're wealthy. We're peaceful. I mean, this is the dream for everyone, is to get, there's jobs, there's education. I mean, if you're from a developing country and you look at Canada or America or Europe, of course you want to go there. I mean, even if you don't want to, you want your kids to be there, so they'll have a future. So people just want to come here for the same reason that we like being here. It's all the same, right? So those two families wanted to get to Europe. They didn't want to leave Syria. They loved Syria, right? But they realized that in Syria they were going to get killed. In Turkey they were going to languish. But if we can get to Germany, then we can give our children a future. A completely understandable, admirable way of thinking, right? They didn't make it. They got turned back by the Turkish Coast Guard. But they're smart, resourceful people, and they had a little bit of money saved up, and they started a business in Turkey, and now they're doing really, really well. And their hope is that when they've saved enough money and when the war has settled down, and they can go back to where they're from, they're going to go back as soon as they can. Like, they want to go home. Just like anyone in this room would want to go home, they want to go home. I know my father, I don't even want to put his experience and their experience in the same sentence, but he was a refugee. He missed Europe terribly, and we lived there for a while. I mean, that's one of the things about refugees is, like, part of them really doesn't want to be here because they miss home. And so I think we have to sort of understand them on that level. But they were fortunate, right? there are a lot of people stuck in refugee camps in Jordan where they can't leave. They're stuck. They're in internment camps, basically.
Well, and isn't the key in those three countries is the question of whether they can absorb the school children, right, and give them education, and whether they can provide, whether you can have a livelihood there because you may be taking a job from someone in the host country. Have you seen are those the two motivators that you've referred to livelihoods, you've referred to education? Are those the two drivers?
And safety. I mean,
no, but I mean to Europe.
Oh, I mean to have a future. Yeah. And I think, and it's sort of understandable. Like Jordan is like, listen, these refugees ultimately are the world's problem. Why do we have to solve the world's problem? And I sort of understand that. And that's where I think we really need, the United States, the world, like we really need a integrated, global, comprehensive solution to, capital letters, the immigration crisis, the refugee crisis. The world should do something to help people that are fleeing for their lives, either for economic reasons or because of war. And the burden should be spread around the world. We, the United States, shouldn't have to absorb it all, and neither should Jordan. I mean, it really needs, like the Paris Climate Accord. I mean, it really needs it's a global problem that needs a global solution. Until we talk about it like that, poor countries like Jordan or Turkey or whatever, they're going to be like, listen, we'll do what we can, but after that, it's sorry. They're going to be stuck in camps because we can't absorb them.
What's wonderful about documentaries is you bring it down to the individual. Right? You can see the problem in terms of the individual. So let's talk a little bit about, is it Radwan is the name?
There's Marwan and Radwan, yes,
Radwan.
the two, yeah.
Obviously his greatest desire is to get out of Syria with his children and wife, to bring them to safety. Tell us about his experiences with smugglers and his route.
Yeah, so understand also that the decision, if you're in ISIS territory, really in any war zone, the decision to leave your home, to try to escape, is incredibly perilous one. I mean, it's an extremely dangerous thing to do. So when you think about these people, think about the fact that they tried every possible option before they decided to flee. That they fled because if they stayed, they would die. And if they flee, they will probably die, but they might make it. That is the calculation that people like the ones in this film are making. It is not, oh, great, a free ride to the West. Like this, it is absolutely terrifying. I mean, just imagine what it'd be like to be hiding in the back of a pickup truck. I mean, I'm sure most of the people in the room have families. Imagine being with your family in the back of a pickup truck, covered by a tarpaulin, hoping to get through an ISIS checkpoint without them looking under the tarpaulin. And if they do and they find you, you'll all be shot. I mean, imagine how scary that is. That's the decision that they had to make. And that shows you how dangerous it was to stay where they were, that they were willing to do that. Thank God they made it. It cost them, I don't know exactly how much, but it cost them thousands and thousands of dollars. They had to pay bribes all the way through. The smuggler was incredibly expensive. Bribes all the way through Turkey. Then they had to pay smugglers to try to get them to Greece. I'm guessing 10 grand. And this, the guy was a garage mechanic in Syria. Like that 10 grand's a lot of money. And they scraped and they managed to do it.
One of the first things that he does when he gets to Turkey is shave his beard. Yeah. Why? What did that mean for him? Well,
ISIS, like the Taliban, insisted on that the men don't shave, and you could be whipped if your beard wasn't long enough, and all kinds of abusive stuff. So, shaving his beard was his way of saying, "All right, we're back in the land of true Islam," is what I believe what he said. Islam does not insist that you grow a beard. That's some sort of freakish idea that extremists came up with, but really Islam doesn't care if you have a beard or not. And it matters, not what's on your chin, it matters what's in your heart. And So yeah, it was a very symbolic, and you know, keep in mind, we didn't shoot this, right? Like Nick shot them a little bit in Turkey once they got to Turkey, but a lot of these scenes, you know, we couldn't get in there, right? So we got them funds so that they could get themselves a camera in ISIS territory, and they documented themselves. I mean, they self-documented. I mean, all that incredible footage. I mean, in some ways, some of the most powerful shots of the film. And we had a bunch of professionals, you know, working for us in northern Iraq. Some of the most powerful shots of the film were shot by those guys on a Samsung 7. So my point is that they weren't performing for a journalist when they went to the barbershop. This was a spontaneous, heartfelt, like, all right, now, you know, like, now we're free of you idiots.
It's the exercise of free choice.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and freedom of religion, yeah.
All of this because of a war that started, how in the film you talk about 2 boys having been tortured, or 2 teenage boys, and that being at the crux of it.
Yeah. So I'm lucky to have an extremely brilliant childhood friend named Sarah Shays. She's at the Carnegie Institute right now. She was an NPR reporter for a long time. In 2001, she drove into Kandahar on a motorcycle. She's a Harvard grad. She's all kinds of things. But she drove into Kandahar on a motorcycle right after 9/11. I mean, the Taliban were still in power, and rented a house and started making herself a sort of world citizen of Kandahar to see what she could do. And she started a business, a soap making business, and taught the Afghans how to manufacture sort of boutique soap, and it's sold all over the world. She came up with, because she speaks Pashtun. She's the only woman in Kandahar driving a truck. She's had to flee, but so she came up with this theory that she started to notice that all of these really radical Islamic movements were born in situations of civil war that were started in part over the issue of corruption. People in that part of the world, many parts of the world, revolt over the financial abuse wrought by criminal cartel governments on the populace. The Taliban came into power because the Afghan government that was left behind after the Soviets pulled out was so unbelievably corrupt. It was a criminal cartel. Somalia, ditto. Syria, Nigeria with Boko Haram, all ghastly movements. But they got traction with the population because they would come in and say, the corrupt criminals that are running your country and supported by Western countries, like, we're going to get rid of them. We are going to bring a fair system to your society so you don't have to pay bribes to policemen. You can actually make a living. So perfectly decent people will welcome in absolutely awful organizations because corruption is an incredibly toxic thing to experience and destroys countries. If you want to stop terrorism, focus on corruption in the world. Stop corruption. That's how it gets its start. That's what gets people to say, you know what, we don't like the Taliban very much, but we're going to let them in. All these radical movements promise an end to corruption. Beat them to it. Force governments that we're allied with to stop corruption, and you really pull the rug out from under some of these movements. And so in Syria, the initial protests were about government corruption, which was just epidemic proportions in Syria, like every other country over there. And those protests were put down violently, and then that violence was protested, and those protests were put down violently, and pretty soon you have people, good people, regular people, ordinary people, getting their hands on guns so they're not just mowed down by soldiers in the street. And then you let that go on for a little while, and pretty soon you have yourself a civil war. I mean, that's how it started.
But this is a case, if you put yourself in the head of Bashar al-Assad, he was facing a potential reformist movement.
Yeah.
Right? And given the choice between that and war, he seems to have chosen the latter. That is to say, he cracked down with full force.
Yeah.
This was not dealt with as as a civil problem.
Yeah. I mean, once the killing starts, it's very hard. It's a ratchet. It's very hard to walk it back. I don't know what would have happened if he had said, I mean, one of the people we interview in the film, for the film, said, had he really embarked on real democratic reforms the way the protesters were asking, I mean, the government was completely corrupt, he would have been ousted and possibly charged and jailed. So Assad...
So that's his calculation.
That's his calculation. Assad made a rational choice to preserve his power and his personal safety. So, I mean, I wish he hadn't, but I mean, I sort of understand the thinking. He also had Iran and Russia behind him. You're not going to topple anyone with those two behind them. So, you know, I think one thing that could happen, you know, in the interest of, again, human suffering, I mean, I think you don't want to put justice ahead of human suffering. I think human suffering is the most important thing. Justice comes after that. I don't think you want to pursue, you have to be careful implacably pursuing justice in a situation where the leader, the dictator, realizes that it's either fight or go to prison, because they will fight, of course. So I think one thing that might help some of these situations is if the world figures out a way to work a deal with these people. Like, if you will step down or agree to democratic reforms, we will give you asylum in a nearby country. You do not have to spend your life in jail, but you also don't have to go to war. We'll take care of you and your family. You can live out your life in Turkey or whatever, or Iran. But you have to leave power. I mean, something like that early on might work. Once the killing starts, it's very, very hard to walk it back.
Let me take you back to the beginning, because some of the question cards, the beginning of the Syrian civil war, a couple of the cards ask, in essence, what choices did the Obama administration face? Was there an opportunity early on? Was there an opportunity to intervene, and should we have?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's such a nightmarish decision. We intervened in Libya. I'll go back. We intervened in Bosnia, it worked great. We intervened in Kosovo, it worked great. We intervened in Liberia, it didn't fire a shot, worked great. The Brits intervened in Sierra Leone, it worked great. It can work. I don't think anyone knows in advance where it's going to work and where it won't. I mean, the French intervened in Mali, worked pretty well. Central African Republic. I mean, that kind of armed intervention can work really well. I think when you have a completely corrupt, sort of dynastic power family running a country like Syria, it's different than intervening in a Liberia. You know, so I would hate to have had to advise President Obama. But so Libya didn't work very well. We didn't intervene in Syria. That worked even worse. I don't think we know where it's going to work and where it won't. My guess is that there are probably conditions on the ground that can determine our level of intervention. I think the idea, and listen, I'm not a military, I'm just a civilian, I'm a journalist, I'm taking a guess here. But I think that a middle ground that does not put American soldiers in harm's way, but does something to protect the civilian population and does put pressure on the government, is to use air power to create a safe space, a safe haven, and allows for the access for humanitarian aid into the population. The more desperate the people are, the more radicalized they will get. If they don't have food, if they don't have anything, black markets spring up very quickly. You know, with that, all kinds of unsavory people get in there. I mean, I think you want some control of the situation, and the red line with the chemical weapons, had he bombed Syrian forces after that, I think it would have set them back a bit. Trump did that and it kind of worked a little bit. So but that wouldn't have ended the war. I think early on, I think what the United States needs is early on in this process, we say, let's broker a deal where you go into you get asylum, and we try to institute democratic norms. If that doesn't work, we will be establishing a safe zone to protect civilian life. We will be doing that. So your choice. I mean, but that has to come really. I think it has to come really early on.
Yeah, one of the people interviewed in your film is Will McCants, who very smart area specialist, who himself talks about what are the compositions of the various rebel forces. What is your sense of that at this point, or at the point at which you were making the film? How clear-cut was it? You know, who was who, and were folks centrally organized?
No, I mean, ISIS was centrally organized. The al-Nusra Front, I think, was pretty well organized. The FSA had really sort of fragmented into a lot of rival factions.
The Free Syrian Army.
The Free Syrian Army. So we called them the Free Syrian Army. That was a name really sort of pasted on them by the media. It was a conglomeration of a lot of different local factions. Some factions only controlled a neighborhood, a few blocks. Some of them really wanted a free democratic Syria. Some of them were criminal cartels of the sort that criminal enterprises of the sort that spring up in any war. I covered Kosovo. There were Albanian rebel fighters in Kosovo who were buying their ammunition from Serb irregulars that they were fighting. All right, because there was money to be made. I mean, they were fighting, right? But they're also selling each other ammunition. As soon as that kind of thing starts immediately, and it just tramples on ideology. You think you can understand this stuff through Albanian nationalism? I mean, that explains some of it, but it doesn't explain everyone's actions, and you cannot be absolutely sure that an Albanian and a Serb who are shooting at each other during the day aren't selling each other stuff at night. I mean, you do not know that.
So take us to another part of the world, and that's Myanmar, Burma. There's a situation in which there's ethnic cleansing going on against the Rohingya, and the issue isn't only what is their fate if they make it to Bangladesh, but some are hauled up in their home country, in Myanmar, and humanitarian assistance can't get to them. On whom do we rely as a society? Are we relying on governments to get to them? Are we relying on nonprofits like the International Rescue Committee and Save the Children and Oxfam and CARE and all these marvelous organizations that are doing great work? On whom do we rely, and does the world rely?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, can France just say we're bringing aid in to Burma, to Myanmar? We don't care if the government doesn't want that. We're just going to do it. I mean, you could do that. You cause a lot of problems. So it works best when you have the cooperation of the host government. When I was in Bosnia, humanitarian aid was flowing into Sarajevo through Serb front lines with the cooperation, the agreement of the Serb forces, right? I mean, you can, I mean, it's odd, right? But you can work with in these situations, and governments that are opposed, that want to eliminate the group you're trying to help will let you help them. It's bizarre, right? So in Burma, I've never been there. I don't know a lot about the situation other than just reading the New York Times every morning. But I think there are international legal norms. There are international laws where if a country is committing gross human rights violations within its own borders, the international community has not only the right but the obligation to intervene diplomatically and eventually militarily, if need be, to bring a stop to the carnage, to the suffering.
Referred to as responsibility to protect, or R2P.
That's right. Yeah. Right. So where that line is, I mean, that's a subjective matter. Like, where does mass killing become genocide? Where does it become gross violations of human rights? I don't know. I mean, that's a legal definition, and it's probably in the eye of the beholder. But there is a line that can be crossed that triggers a completely legal military intervention in a sovereign country.
One of the questioners asks about the appeal of ISIS. And here I'm going to take you back to talking about a sense of belonging in war. Is that part of the appeal of terror groups, is giving a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, no matter how distorted, how horrifying, but is that what part of the appeal is?
I mean, okay, so there's a whole range of appeals. Like if ISIS rolls into your town with a convoy 100 pickup trucks long, part of the appeal of ISIS is that if you don't join them, they'll kill you, right? So there's the sort of coercive end. All the way on up to why would a middle-class kid in England or in France see ISIS in social media and online media and decide, oh, that I want to be part of that. Like what and these are normal kids, right? That are joining ISIS. This is not. I mean, the guy, I blanked on his name, in Vegas, the killer in Vegas. Yeah. He was a deranged person, obviously, right? These people joining ISIS are not deranged, right? I mean, some of them are, but you have to understand the appeal of ISIS in sort of normal human terms. And the kids in Europe that are joining ISIS, they're not desperately poor either, right? I mean, these are middle-class kids. They're second generation, third generation kids. I think I hope I can remember this correctly. There's a wonderful band called Queens of the Stone Age, and they have a song, and the lyrics go something like, "I want something to die for to make it beautiful to live." There's really quite a profound insight into what motivates people. A lot of people's lives feel meaningless, feel empty, feel like without purpose, like they're just going through the motions. They're in school, they have a job, they're whatever. They're not affecting the world, and they're not acting with belief, right? If you're willing to risk your life because you believe in something, you're really living. In a very profound human way, you're really living. And I think some of the sort of malaise and discontent in sort of middle-class European society gives rise to young people thinking, wow, ISIS, it's a community. It's portrayed online as a kind of social utopia. If I go over there, I'll belong to it. I'll be doing something meaningful, or I'll die heroically. I mean, these are 17, 18-year-olds, right? I mean, they're prone to all kinds of romantic thinking. And then they're over there, and of course, a few of them, 1 in 1,000 is a sociopath, like in any population. But I think most of them, we've interviewed some of them, were just shocked at the reality and desperate to get out. And in the full-length film, we interview someone who speaks very eloquently about what a lie the whole thing is. And he was very lucky to get out, and he gave us an amazing interview.
One of the things that experts in terrorism wrestle with is the difference in appeal between al-Qaeda on the one hand and ISIS on the other. ISIS having a much more dramatic pull. Yeah. Now, part of this you could say is that they're standing on the shoulders of al-Qaeda in the sense that some of the work has been done. But ISIS also offers or offered a homeland, which is a pretty powerful force.
Yeah, I mean, the strength of terrorist networks is that they're networks, and they don't necessarily exist in any time and place. There are interlocking affiliations between people and groups. ISIS established territorial control. They could legitimately say, this spot on the map, this is the capital of the caliphate, and this area on the map, this is ISIS territory. And that gave them a kind of street cred that al-Qaeda couldn't hope to compete with. Al-Qaeda controlled territory in Afghanistan, around Kandahar, during the reign of the Taliban. I think one of the reasons the Taliban didn't hand those guys over is because they didn't have the military capability to do it after 9/11. When, I don't know if you remember, President Bush said, hand them over and we'll come in and help your country. If you don't hand them over, we're going to come in and get them. I think one of the reasons the Taliban didn't hand them over is because they couldn't. But, I mean, I'm guessing, I don't know. But, so ISIS holding territory is that's an incredibly powerful message. And it really is a kind of middle finger to the Western European establishment that thinks that they control the world. Like, no, you don't. We control a chunk of it that's 10 times the size of Britain or whatever. What are you going to do about it?
But now that control is gone.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right.
we have time for just one more question, I'm sorry to say, but this questioner notes that you referred to the sort of withdrawal, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, creating kind of a vacuum into which, in which Al-Qaeda was born. This questioner asks, what about our withdrawal of troops from Iraq? Did we create the circumstances under which were provided an opportunity for ISIS to start to take hold and then build camps in Syria?
Yeah, so I didn't cover Iraq. I was, and again, as a journalist, my impartiality, my neutrality is extremely important to me. And I found myself, unlike Afghanistan, where I thought we could do a lot of good, I found myself so opposed to Iraq that I didn't think I could be neutral about it as a journalist, so I didn't cover it. So I have not been there, but the people that we interviewed, including General Petraeus on down, we interviewed a lot of very knowledgeable, smart people, and the consensus was, all the way down, including very knowledgeable Iraqis. The consensus was that our entry into Iraq brought a level of violence to that part of the world. It normalized, in the words of one Iraqi photographer who we interview extensively, it normalized violence in that society. He said, drive around, you see dead bodies everywhere, you see American rockets blowing up buildings, whatever, you see all kinds of, and it became normal. And then the U.S. Basically put a Shia government into power. They started beating up on the Sunnis. The Sunnis had to protect themselves. We did not wade in and sort that out. It was an extremely unfair situation for the Sunnis. De-Baathification was a huge mistake. It put a lot of perfectly good people on the street with nothing to do. We could have used their help, and they were turned out. That was a terrible mistake by Paul Bremer. And eventually ISIS came. ISIS started in Iraq. I mean, ISIS came in and said, "We will protect you from the regime in Baghdad in exchange for your allegiance," and that's how it started. And it didn't need to, and it did.
Strikes me that some of the lessons of your remarks, but also of your movie, is that you have to have a sense of the long game. You have to have a sense of, and then what?
Yeah.
So I want to take you to just one final theme, and then we'll thank you for this time. But you began with talking about the sense of brotherhood combatants have in war, and we went on and talked a little bit about the sense of brotherhood that those who are attracted to extremist groups, even terrorist groups, have. As you look at us right now as a society, would we benefit from a stronger sense of brotherhood at this moment?
Obviously, I'm going to say yes. I mean, humans belong in groups. We evolved for groups. Right now, we in America are attempting this incredible experiment, very noble experiment, to see if we can live in a fair and equitable and just group of 300 plus million people. It's never been done before in human history, and we're doing it in a fashion. One of the problems with modernity is it allows people, the poorer the society, the more collaborative people have to be. There's upsides and downsides to that. At the hunter-gatherer level, there is very little evidence of suicide, of depression, apparently very little PTSD. The wealthier you get in a society, because people live more individualized lives and there's more economic inequality, the more at risk people are of suicide and depression and everything else. That's the irony of wealth, right? We're living in a country of 300 million. a disaster, a crisis would bring us together immediately, right? In 9/11, after 9/11 in New York City, the suicide rate went down, the murder rate went down, violent crime went down, right? People act well. People are at their best in the worst circumstances. They're at their worst in the best circumstances. And we, as a wealthy modern country, have created the best circumstances. Some pretty bad behaviors come out. The Wall Street crash of 2008, I mean, the behavior of those people that bankrupted this country and cost us $14 trillion, bad behavior, right? Mass shootings, what is that? There's a lot of countries, every country in the world has crazy people in it. And there's a lot of countries with more guns and fewer gun controls than we have. And we are the only country that does this to ourselves. What is going on? I think the short version of the political partisanship in Washington, I mean, the short version, the short answer to all of those ills is that we are not a unified country. And we do that proactively. It's not because we're not religious enough, it's not because we're not patriots, it's none of that, right? We do not go out of our way to think of ourselves as a unity. I think national service, I don't think it's moral to force someone to fight a war they don't believe in, but it's entirely moral to insist that people contribute to their country for a year or two. That would create a unity. We need more people voting. We need less gerrymandering. We need an active ethos in Washington where politicians that speak with derision and contempt for their political opponents, that they be roundly criticized by their own political party. We need a culture like that in Washington. I'm talking about both the Democrats and the Republicans. We need to do that. And that will create a unity of 300 plus million that I think that unity, I think, trickles down and will affect every town, every neighborhood, every individual in some way. But it is sick at the top, and it's making everyone else sick.
A lot of people talk about the trickle up, which may be the solution from communities.
Yes.
Please join me in thanking Sebastian Junger.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.